Those who committed crimes will be held accountable. And today we're announcing charges against 6 individuals from 2 state departments, the Michigan Department of Environmental Quality and the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services.
On March 22, 2012, a pipeline to Lake Huron from Genesee County, Michigan was approved as a cheaper way to get water to the city of Flint. And while this massive pipeline was to be constructed, Flint would get its water from the nearby Flint River from the old pipes that had sat there for years. The local governmental leaders were fine with this measure because cutting costs meant that lowering taxes was a possibility, which meant more support from the voters. However, it is impossible to think that the health risks were not brought up. In fact, there are documents acknowledging that many leaders brought up the health risks before the eventual declaration of a state of emergency. What they chose to ignore was that the river had been contaminated for decades by being the location of GM manufacturing plants, so choosing this location as the water supply for the town was already ridiculous. But even when numerous red flags came up, these notions were tabled by the authorities in charge, and so around 100,000 people were exposed to lead poisoning and E. coli bacteria that was thriving in the old, rusty, and unchecked pipelines. In the end, a dozen people were murdered by the negligence of a committee only caring about their yearly expenditures. What makes the Flint story so terrifying is that such a failure for a government to be concerned about the welfare of its constituents could happen to anybody, anywhere, or even at a higher level of government. Without enough public involvement in government, we cannot trust that the government has our best interests in mind.
There are all kinds of game. Mike here, for instance. He's got everything. He's young, he's healthy, got a job. And he's got plenty of food. Big factories to make things a man can use. Big cities to do the business of a big company. And people. Lots of people. Enough to work the farm and build the factories, dig the mines, run the business. All kinds of people. People from different countries with different religions, different colored skins. Free people. They can live together and work together and build America together because they're free. Free to vote, to say what they please, go to their own churches, to pick their own jobs. Yeah, Mike's got something, all right. He's got America.
Well, it's true. Mike sure does have America and all the benefits of living in a republic. But is it really true that the people have all the power in our system? Fourth grade social studies textbook would tell you so, for the people choose their representatives in the legislature as well as the candidate for the presidency. And on an elementary level, this makes sense. However, looking more closely at the system, the people might not have as much political freedom as one might want to believe. Political ideas are completely controlled by 2 main parties, in which most Americans are forced to fall into. These parties therefore control the political stances of 300 million people and the actions of their politicians, who only care about not angering their political allies and financial backers. In truth, the power lies with the parties and politicians, and there are many who are fine with this. When the government is able to control things, it is a burden off everyone's shoulder. But, unfortunately, giving the government complete control over things such as these means there is no market to compete with, and thus, they have no incentive to improve. It seems that many of these programs sponsored in the legislature are created prematurely without being fully vetted through logic. Take the car allowance rebate system, for example. CARS, commonly known as Cash for Clunkers, was a national incentive program for the government to buy older, fuel-inefficient cars in order to encourage the purchase of newer, more efficient vehicles that began on July 1st, 2009. This program, bipartisanly supported, was supposed to rejuvenate the car industries after the 2008 recession. This idea was brilliant in the eyes of both the environmentally minded left and the manufacturing supporting right. A program that would save the American citizen money at the gas pump, and make the car company lobbyists happy? It was a win-win. Except, the plan was doomed from the start. Even forming Cash for Clunkers became a controversy. The backers of cars put the immediate implementation of the system into a larger funding bill without passing it through either house, which was unconstitutional. But the program was implemented anyways. The reason there was a stipulation against this action was that when adding money-draining sections in post, the budget may not be prepared for such a massive spending spree. Unfortunately, this is exactly what the taxpayers got. A program that looked good on paper, but would have negative consequences almost immediately. With an initial allocation of $1 billion, and a large majority of Congress not even batting an eye, the United States government once again shoved the American taxpayer into a job of filling the holes created by illogical deficit spending. When all was said and done, the program had gotten some traction, especially in the first few weeks of implementation, but inability to maintain servers for the masses of people who wanted money off the purchase of a new car, and the expenditure of the entire car's budget before the end of the first month, led to cars being shut down by Labor Day of that year, an obvious failure.
A new study concludes the government's Cash for Clunkers program was a bit of a clunker. The research by two economists concludes the program did help auto sales for the 2 months it was in place, but pretty quickly after that it hurt auto sales by the same amount.
A study in 2010 done by Atif Armian and Amir Sufi found that while 360,000 additional cars were bought and sold in the 2 months that cars was run, the next 7 months had very low car sales due to the oversaturation of the market. This meant that the program had done nothing, yet cost over $1.4 billion, directly affecting the taxpayers cars was attempting to help.
Such financial failure was not new to 2009 America, however. In fact, many of today's problems are caused by one institution that was created in 1913. Before this year, the greatest period of economic growth in the history of America happened, and this was directly caused by having no central bank system. After the briefly lived panic of 1873, the economy came back strongly through the use of hard currency policies and industrialization. If the period of highest economic prosperity was during a time with no Federal Reserve, then should we be keeping one now? Also, the US never had a persistent problem with inflation before the Federal Reserve System. The Reserve practically had a systematic penalty for those trying to save their money. Over time, this tax of inflation adds up, and the value of the US dollar has fallen about 83% since the 1870s. Over the past 10 years, the Federal Reserve has an astounding track of failure. But despite this fact, President Obama renominated Ben Bernanke for a second term as the chairman of the Federal Reserve. Bernanke has been telling the American people that everything is going to be fine, and no major problems lay ahead. An obvious attempt at a placebo for the economy and citizens of America, instead of presenting and addressing the problem openly. An example of this tactic failing for the Reserve is the 2008 crisis. Before the recession, the chairman of the Federal Reserve, Alan Greenspan, wanted to end his career highly and the banks to have a good year, which meant that they and the people needed to borrow loans and invest more. The Reserve lowered tax rates for the banks and gave them huge bonuses from making loans. With the low tax rates, people invested into mortgage bonds, the thought to be safest option for saving money. The banks decided to ensure that anyone with a pulse received a loan, and the people took them because the real estate market was historically safe and had never had a bubble. These subprime loans that banks gave out were rated as high standard loans from reviewers. Banks paid bond raters to put the loans that were impossible to pay off into the best category, so that they would make more profit. Because the banks didn't look away from the money, nothing was done to solve the problem. The Federal Reserve didn't do anything either because of the low funding for the Federal Trade Committee, causing a lack of financial oversight. Ultimately, the government's ignorance of regulation caused the 2008 crisis, and to solve it, they bailed out banks at the expense of the American taxpayer. A high-level framework applied to all regulation making should be created and implemented to provide guidance to regulators on how to conduct retrospective evaluation. This is something that the government should be trying to accomplish, but as of now, the government has proven that it cannot be trusted with public funds. Things haven't gotten better with the decades, from when the Great Depression occurred and the government spent millions subsidizing dairy, to the crash in 2008, which caused the worst bank bailouts in American history, of which were geared to help the common person, but only help the bank owner.
When the plans and ideas made by the government are implemented, they can turn out inefficient and sometimes end up being shut down or even worse, kept running with no foreseeable end. One such program had roots from the Great Depression, when the government helped farmers by buying their cheese and giving it out to the needy. This subsidization, becoming more common in the early 1960s, ended in 2012 but has accumulated over 1.2 billion pounds of cheese, even with the limited distribution. Now, there's a problem of what to do with the excess cheese. During the Reagan administration, the cheese was given out to the needy, and now, Secretary of Agriculture Tom Vilsack has implemented another subsidized system, but this time on a smaller scale that basically takes approximately $450 million of taxpayer money per year, and instead of hoarding the cheese, it allows for more distribution to food banks. However, it is very likely that the government can't fully distribute the cheese without causing economic harm to the industry, and so stockpiles still continue to climb in order to try and keep America's dairy industry in business. Although the government is attempting to make change, dairy producers and farmers have had a 35% decrease in income in the past 2 years due to market crashes in China, one of the main buyers of American dairy. Now there is an ever larger amount of excess cheese due to the sheer amount of cows and supply of perishable milk. With nowhere to go, the government has to step in to buy and hoard the cheese in order to keep prices low and stabilize the market, which means that the cycle of government interference continues until the dairy market can become stable. Unlikely in a future where people are drinking less milk and eating less cheese, so much so that the government has to strike deals with corporations such as McDonald's to use extra cheese on their burgers and butter instead of margarine. As time goes on, the system gets worse as more government spending is put into keeping the dairy industry running, a sign of the lack of efficient tracking and thought spent on a government project. But the fault shouldn't lie solely on the lawmakers themselves, but also on the complacency of the people. If everyone decides to do nothing against a government that has proven time after time, failure after failure, that should not be trusted with the public support and money, unfortunately, the only true fix to this would be a complete rework of the American system, which would not only be incredibly difficult to write legislature to do this, but also to get the politicians to dispose of a system that is so incredibly in their favor. But luckily, as a people, we do have one tool up our sleeves: our vote. As long as we aren't being manipulated, we can use our vote to influence those politicians who care only about the re-election and money. If as a people, we emailed our representatives when some injustice takes place, we could make a difference. Organizations like Free the Net work towards getting the word out on things such as net neutrality, working on having popular support in order to send messages to Congress, and informing them that the people stand together. Movements can even take a more direct approach, as marches across the world have been shown to work together. Should these things be done to shed light on reforms like term limits and campaign donation caps, hopefully the best people will be in positions of power. Then, just maybe, incompetence will be reduced. The government just might not be so careless to poison its people for years through a dirty water system. It may think before it enacts legislation to create a program that will in effect accomplish nothing. It may not put power in a private institution that causes recessions and underfund the committee that could possibly regulate it. And it might even choose to use the products that it subsidizes for a good cause rather than let them gather dust. Our system failures lie in its incompetence, its negligence, and its corruption. Once the American people realize that, a difference can be made.
In fact, there's a local group that has decided to fight the system by creating a movement specifically aimed to cut government inefficiencies. And after a bit of deliberation, they agreed to let us film them as long as they got publicity. After we initially met, they decided we could come on with them to one of their protests in Nashville, and even let Alma join in on the fun.
Alright, so who are you guys?
We are Cheddar. We are Legion. We do not forgive. We do not forget. Expect us.
Cheddar, is that an acronym for something?
Yes, the Cooperative Hendersonville Dairy Revolutionaries.
And so, what's your whole point?
To incite a violent revolution to redistribute the cheese that the American government is keeping from you and from me.
And where's this cheese held?
In a cave in Missouri.
Alright, is there...
cheese is in a cave in Missouri. Hasn't been touched since 1983 under the Ronald Reagan administration. Are you going to do something about it, or will you stand idle by? Whose cheese?
Our cheese.
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 Their attention, Doc. This is the Cooperative Hendersonville Dairy Revolutionaries. This is a PSA about an atrocity that is going on in your nose right now, and that is an atrocity of cheese and of gluttony. Since the Great Depression, the United States Agricultural Department has been subsidizing dairy and turning it into cheese. They are hiding 1.3 billion pounds of cheese in a cave in Missouri, and they are keeping it from you. As an American, this is your birthright, and they are keeping it from you. Will you join us? Will you do something about it? Or will you just stand by and watch as the gluttonous, capitalist pigs steal your cheese? Whose cheese?
Our cheese.
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 This is a protest. We're the American people, representing the proletariat who you are stealing from. We are the people, and we the people declare that we want what is ours. We want our constitutional right. We want our birthright, and that is the cheese that the government is hoarding in Missouri. They are keeping it from you and from me and from all of us. What will you do about it? Nothing? Join us.
Where are you guys going to next?
We're going to the War Memorial.
And
Yes, just behind us. We're gonna accost some people and convince them to join the violent revolution that is the redistribution of the government cheese.
Alright, sounds good. Let's go.
Alright.
subsidizing dairy, and they're turning it into cheese, and they have 1.3 billion pounds of it, and they're not doing anything with it. Oh. Yeah, I know. Alright. Hello, sir. It's going pretty well. What is a permit to protest?
Yeah, to demonstrate.
To demonstrate? No, I do not have a permit to demonstrate.
What are you guys protesting?
We are protesting the 1.3 billion pounds of cheese that the United States federal government has in the cave in Missouri. And we believe that they should, give it to people on welfare like they did under the Ronald Reagan administration.
Do you know that it's illegal to protest with a mask on?
No, I didn't.
Yeah. But you can go ahead and protest.
Oh yeah, thank you. Thanks, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Take your cheese
The
back.
revolution is now. the government is keeping the cheese from you. There's 1.3 billion pounds of it, and they aren't using it. Why shouldn't we? Will you stand by or will you join us? Yes, join us. The time is now.
We're from Wisconsin, bro. We got the cheese.
But we don't, man.
These guys are up to something.
You know who's really up to something, though?
What?
The United States federal government.
Yes.
Hey, I'm serious, man. We got something to protest.
I love this shit.
So how did you feel about the protest today?
Honestly, not so good. You see, the more I fight, the more futile the fight becomes. For years I've been on this grind of, fighting the government, taking the cheese. But it seems that no one else has passion for the idea. So, I decided this a while ago. I think it's time for the dream to end. I'll see you in the afterlife, where the streets are paved with cheddar. Viva la revolución!
Everywhere you look, everywhere there's a heart, a hand to hold on to. Everywhere you look, everywhere there's a face of somebody who needs you.
So how'd you feel about the protest today?
Actually, pretty rough. I mean, I've been on this grind for a couple of years now.
Add me on Snapchat at
You know what, Sean? This is a serious moment.